Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for Election Matters 2020, hosted by Powell Tate. I'm Jack Leslie, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator for this four-part webinar series designed to help you and your organizations navigate the U.S. elections. And these are pretty turbulent times to navigate as the pandemic, a recession, and a national dialogue about race and structural inequities all intersect at once. First, a few brief words about Powell Tate, the Public Affairs Division of Weber Shandwick, founded by Jody Powell, the press secretary to President Jimmy Carter, and Sheila Tate, the press secretary to First Lady Nancy Reagan. Powell Tate has deep bipartisan traditions, and that commitment to political diversity, both in our work and in our teams, I hope will come through in this series as we bring together notable figures in politics and advocacy and the media to discuss how this election is different, how the issues are at play, and what comes next. I'll do my best to keep our discussion civil and respectful, given how polarized the political environment is today. Importantly, the candidates' policies and opinions discussed are not endorsed by Powell Tate or Weber Shandwick. So now this bipartisan approach is certainly embodied by our guests this afternoon in our first webinar, and what a better place to start than with polling. We're joined by two distinguished pollsters, Democrat Margie O'Mara and Republican John McLaughlin. Margie is a principal at GBAO with over 20 years of experience providing strategic advice using quantitative and qualitative research. She's worked with hundreds of Democratic candidates for office, as well as some of the world's biggest brands, nonprofits, and advocacy groups. She's worked with the Democratic National Committee, the DCCC, Emily's List, and the Center for American Progress, among others. Marjorie now, among other things, helps lead the Navigators research team, which is a monthly investigation into public opinion on top political news. John is the CEO of McLaughlin and Associates and is a leading consultant for Republican candidates. He is currently an advisor and pollster for President Donald Trump, a role he also played in the successful 2016 campaign from the primaries through Election Day. In a career spanning over 35 years, John's clients have included former presidential candidates Steve Forbes and Fred Thompson, former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, 22 former and current U.S. senators, and 16 members of Congress. He's also worked with leaders and candidates internationally. So before we dive in, just one quick programming note. We'll try to save a bit of time at the end of this for a few questions from our viewers. So if you do have a question, feel free to submit it through the Zoom chat feature, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. So Marjorie, John, welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Hi there, how are you? You know, I can't resist. I know it's 46 days from Election Day, but I can't resist kind of going back to 2016, because I think it would be an understatement to say, you know, that people were surprised by the result. Polls and pollsters got criticized for getting it wrong. So I'll start with you, Margie. Were the polls wrong then? Were we reading them wrong? And what did we learn from 2016?
Well, I think there were a couple things that happened. I think first, you saw, the national polls that accurately showed that Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote, while state public polls were, helped, build a national case and models that suggested that that Clinton would win the Electoral College as well. And it was really due to a variety of different state polls. When people went back and readjusted those state polls for education and some other variables, which I think the industry really learned from that exercise, that really reduced the error considerably. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. There were a couple other things that happened. You had models that showed between 75 and a 90% chance that Clinton was going to win, and that would lead to stories and conventional wisdom that would talk about Clinton transition and so on. So you had small errors in some state polls lead to, people feeling one way based on the forecasting, and then stories written based on the forecasting that really magnified that error. But I don't think it was just the public polls. And, I'm curious as to what John would say, but, I spoke to Tony Fabricio, who's another Trump pollster in 2016. And he said on election day, he thought it was going to be he gave it a 55% chance that Clinton was going to win. Certainly folks on the left thought that Clinton was going to win. So it wasn't just only a couple of public state polls. There were a variety of things, I think, that happened.
Well, and John, anything that surprised you?
I thought, like Margie said, I thought the polls were more likely to be right if you looked at them and read them correctly. It was going to be a close race, but I thought the media spin was just so biased against us, and it's gotten even more biased this election, because 4 years ago they didn't think we could win. Now they're afraid we're going to win. So the media bias, the way they cast the polls, and the way they, because what we're talking about is, most of these campaigns, we don't release our polls. Biden people don't release their polls because that's secret information as part of the strategy. But the media polls, I used to work for CBS Radio because they said I had, look good on radio. But so I did the CBS radio polling for years with Jeff Garin. Jeff, very good Democratic pollster. Yep. And like Margie said, but like in 2000, when we were looking at the exit polls, we were telling the radio, don't make the call for Gore, because when you do the adjustments on Florida, it's a dead heat. And instead, the TV made the call. And then in 2004, they had crashes with these exit polls. And the media there's a lot of polls out right now that are repeating the same errors of 2006. The underpoll Republicans, there's national polls out there with 25, 23, 24% Republicans. The last two elections, a good election in 16, a bad election in 18, still both had 33% Republicans in the turnout, record turnouts. And there's a lot of media polls that are underpolling us, and the statewide, you're getting the same thing, and they're all over the lot. And this year, I think the thing that Margie will agree with me is it's going to be so much harder this year because of the early voting, and you'll certainly get into these questions with other topics, but we're doing all sorts of things to, like 4 years ago, we were doing likely voter screens, and we're looking at the likely voter pool. We're saying it's a close election. We're saying anything could win the election. We're sending Donald Trump from 6 a.m. to midnight, 5-6 states a day, even over the weekend. And we were making a judgment that we could win the election based on turnout, because the strategy was to bring out new voters. And it worked. And I even one point I said in a phone call, if the president called me before he took office, right before Christmas, say thanks again and talk about some poll numbers. And I was like, well, at least we didn't make you pay for a landslide. And he says, no, it's a huge, he says it was a huge win. And I was like, no, it was 78,000 votes out of 139 million. And, it was 46,000 in Pennsylvania, 22,000 in Wisconsin, 10,000 in Michigan. And it couldn't have been any closer. And he said, well, you're getting good press out of it. I said, if we had lost, I would have gotten more press, and it would have been bad from you. So it was like,
take us through. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but we do have a lot of folks, I'm sure, are listening in who don't know all the ins and outs of polling. So maybe do a little polling 101. We start maybe Margie with you, and then go to John. But talk to us about how the research is being used now in campaigns. I'm talking about the stuff that you just said.
So I think when people think
behind the scenes, and is it different? And how different is it than it was, say, either in the last cycle or the last few cycles? What's sort of changed at the way campaigns are using research?
Yeah, so, corporate polling is different than campaign internal polling, which is different than media public polling, which is different than organization, nonprofit, and advocacy polling. They all have different uses and different tools and different sense of what they're trying to figure out. So public polling that you see in the press, they want something for their reporters, basically. They want something for their outlets to cover content about what they're interested in. So media polling will ask questions about what they care about. And sometimes that's like the news of the day kind of stuff. It depends on the outlet. Like they're covering things that are happening in Washington that maybe voters don't necessarily care about, but it's important to the people who cover politics. So they don't necessarily get deep in the weeds on policy. They don't get deep in the weeds on candidates' images or their messaging. They really do kind of a broad take on a variety of issues. Typically, that it varies from outlet to outlet. Then you have corporate polling where they're trying to figure out their share and what would get people to net promoter scores, right? What would get people to refer their product or service to somebody else, and really learn about all the different ways that people use their product and the obstacles to using it. Now, campaign polling, that is very clear what the goal is. They want to figure out how a candidate can win. It's less about up to down three, although of course that's important. That is less the purpose. It is also to see not just where the race is, but where it could go. And that's different from what a lot of media outlet stuff will do. So it will test things that voters haven't heard yet, while media outlets will test things that typically people have heard or is available, stuff that's available in the news. So internal polling will have, positive messages about the candidates. It will have negative contrast messages about the candidates. It will ask people about other things on the ballot, whether it's on, if you're running for Senate or if you're running for Congress or a state representative, you would ask about the top of the ticket. Ask about ballot measures, other things that are happening in the state, so you get a better sense of what people are thinking, plus their views generally toward how things are going in the state and other kinds of priorities. So that has a different set of questions. And internal campaign work is not just about crunching the numbers. I think people think of pollsters as like all kind of Nate Silver statistician types. There's a lot of qualitative that goes into it. There's a lot of listening. It's not just number crunching and calculating. There's listening to voters. There's a lot of writing things in a way that people understand, not just what your client wants to say, but a way that people understand it and is accessible to them. So figuring out how to translate client to candidate, voter to candidate and candidate to voter is part of the job. And so that requires listening and real writing and having an ear for how people process issues. So all of that is part of how candidates and campaign teams look at polling, and also to see how things are moving, what's happening in a certain media market, what's happening with a certain audience, who's persuadable, who's less persuadable, what moves people, what people, is there a backlash if you talk about an issue? How do people respond to a candidate on camera? That's something you don't see as much, public polling, but, how do people respond to candidates when they see them and hear them? So all of those things are part of what goes on in the team dynamics.
Yeah. John, I used to, I don't know whether I was a campaign consultant a while ago. And I used to tell my clients, the polls are rearview mirrors. I mean, they tell you kind of where you've been. I mean, you need pre-search, not just research. You've got to try to find the way, as Margie says, the strategies that take you to one point in time in the future where you've got to get 50% plus one. So as you work through the Trump campaign, and I can't help but ask, as I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds, as you work through the messaging and so forth on where the president should be going with his messaging in the campaign, and given that he is well known for testing his own messages out in crowds or with the media or on Twitter, is it unique in that campaign? You've done so many campaigns. Talk to us about the process that Marjorie really just went through of providing that kind of strategic advice in the Trump campaign.
Well, you must have been a very good consultant for your clients, because you're right. Like Marjorie said, we're both trying to figure out how to get 51%, and we're trying to figure out, how do we get there to look around the corners to be able to predict what we're going to get and how we get there. And with President Trump, I've known him for a while, but he's not your typical candidate. And I've always said I was fortunate. I used to work for a fellow named Arthur Finkelstein in the 80s, and he was one of Reagan's pollsters. And I used to work for, then after that, for Brizio and I were partners in the 90s. But the most depressing thing with Finkelstein he'd say, the worst thing is, I'd deliver a poll to a candidate and I'd say, where do we stand on this issue? Because it's important. And he would say, what does the poll say? We didn't like to work for candidates like that. We like to work for somebody who believes in something. Donald Trump is one of those candidates. He's totally unique in history. He's a businessman who got elected outside of the political process came in, and he, in effect, the first campaign he got into, he won. So he's not like any typical candidate where you have, like, Joe Biden has a long career in politics, and so there's a lot of traditional probably campaigning going on inside that campaign, where polls and ads and all that kind of stuff. And President Trump's a businessman who he's a PR expert in his own right, because he built himself into a multi-billion empire through public relations and his brand name. So you got to know when you're delivering, we're crunching numbers all the time, and you're reading data all the time. And he's a bottom line kind of businessman. And he'll ask you flat out, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And he likes to have people push opposite opinions in front of him, where he's going to make a judgment, but he has a gut instinct. And I'll tell you, the thing that was really good about the last campaign and since, he really has a good connection for working class people, because he came out of the development, the construction side, where he thrives on talking with regular people, and he has a good gut instinct. And you're polling, you better, if he asks you a question, you better know the answers, and you better have done your homework, because
I can imagine.
Yeah,
I can imagine. Margie, we were talking just before we came on the program about how remarkably stable these numbers in a way are when you consider the volatility of this race, or not the volatility of the race, but the chaos and volatility of the environment that surrounds us. And yet the numbers seem to be awfully stable. What accounts, for that? And what, and I'll ask you this too, John, what could likely, or not likely, but what could happen in the next 46 days that could change that dynamic more fundamentally?
So there's a couple things, right? I mean, the race, taking aside the race for a minute, which has also been fairly stable, you have Trump's approval rating, which itself has been stable. And obviously we're living in an incredibly unstable, unsettling, volatile, difficult time in terms of the economy, in terms of the coronavirus, in terms of racial tension and protests, a lack of confidence in government, and we have a variety of different real serious crises. But despite all that, Trump's approval rating has, been relatively stable since the beginning. He's been underwater since he took office, and it's been stable in that regard, with some different higher and lower moments, but still underwater, meaning more disapprove of the job he's doing than approve of the job since he took office. And so I think part of the reason for that is that, even though those numbers have been stable, doesn't mean that they're not without intensity. There's a very large percentage of Americans who feel very strongly against the president. If you look at a lot of the public polling, it's often almost half who feel, strongly unfavorable toward the job that he's doing. And so that number doesn't really change that much. And what could change, what could happen in the next few weeks to change that fundamental concept, a fundamental underlying thing of what's happening in the election? I don't know. I don't know if there's anything that can change that part, that there's a really, I don't think there's anything that the president seems likely to do that would change that part, frankly, just based on observing him. Now, what could happen in the race? There's all kinds of things that could happen that could change things in the race. We have debate that's going to happen. There's, economic and coronavirus instability. Schools are reopening and college campuses are closing. But there's, the economy. There's about, half of the electorate who feel that, who say that they know someone who has lost jobs or hours because of the coronavirus. And there's a lot that's happening. So it's hard to say what could happen that could cause change. That I can't predict that sort of thing in the future, but there are a variety of things that, seem unsettling, right? Talk of a vaccine, worries about, people feeling worried about voting, although, the news from Virginia and other places that people are out voting early in droves.
Yeah. John, what do you think? And about both the stability of these numbers, but also tied a little bit to the criticism I hear sometimes of the Trump campaign that he's not working as hard to expand the base. I mean, he's working hard. I mean, I saw you raise your eyebrows. He's definitely working hard, but to expand his base and so that the numbers stay the same. Is there truth to that? Do you see underlying numbers that are showing some kind of shifts that we're not seeing?
Well, I think the thing that we've argued all year against is that a lot of these polls don't really reflect the voter universe, and that's why they were wrong in 2016, and that's why we thought we could win when nobody else did. But because they were assuming Hillary Clinton was going to be Barack Obama, and she wasn't, so the likely voter universe, and the actual voter universe, was different than when Obama ran. And the big difference was in 2012 you had Barack Obama, there were 130 million people that came out. And Barack Obama on election day, after Hurricane Sandy had repaired whatever his job approval was, and he got 51% job approval on election day, and he won with 51%. And this is the post 9/11 era, where even in 2004, when George W. Bush got reelected, he had a 51% job approval through most of the year. On election day, at a 51% job approval, he was reelected with 51%. Yeah. And when you look at the numbers now, if it's a likely voter poll, and by the way, this is a big difference because, okay, so Obama and Romney, they had 130 million people come out in 2012. We had a record in 2016, 139 million, but there's almost 240 million eligible adults in the United States. And you can see both sides, the Biden campaign, the Trump campaign, trying to bring out more of their voters because this is a historic election in that you've never had a global pandemic, depression levels of unemployment, race riots, all in 1 year. The volatility is unbelievable. So the turnout will probably be even higher than the last record. And, each side is trying to get out their vote, but the polling doesn't reflect that. So you have polls that have, as I said, they'll have adults, they'll have registered voters, and it looks stable because the universe is underpolling Republicans, overpolling Democrats. The president, for most of the year, operated in a job approval level of the mid to high 40s among likely voter polls. Ever since probably right about the convention, I mean, one of the likely voter polls that we like to cite a lot of times because they were, good last time was Rasmussen Reports. And they have us at a 53% job approval today. They had them up by a point after losing all year in a national poll. And when you go back to the polls from 2016, between May and election day, there were 173 national polls, and only 13 had us ahead back then. And, everybody was saying 85% chance we were going to lose on election day, et cetera. And it was because they were polling a universe that in their mind looked stable and looked good, but it didn't reflect people who are actually going to vote. And this year it's going to be even harder because you've got to calculate for early mail-in absentee ballots. You got to calculate for early in-person voting that could go up, and you got to calculate for who remains on election day to go out. And then you're going to have these ballots coming in after election day. It's going to be very complex, very tricky. And if you don't make the adjustments, you'll miss the punchline as they did 4 years ago. So I'm trying to get at why the polls so consistently underpoll Republicans. Is it I have heard, which one of the questions I wanted to ask about the so-called shy or hidden Trump voters who may not answer that they're voting for Trump when they get called. But you're suggesting it's much different than that. That pollsters, as they do their analysis, are not accounting for turnout and what are, I guess you're saying, truly likely voters. Is that why they're getting underpolled so often? Well, I think some of it's budget. Margie will tell you that campaign polls are more expensive. That to do them properly, you have to have mixes, cell phone or online or landline, because generationally it's getting harder. You got to have bilingual surveys. So campaign polls are usually more expensive. So the media a lot of times trims their budget, and they'll do a poll of adults or registered voters because when you screen for likely voters, you got to make more calls and it's harder to get. So right. What they do is, and when you do that, that's when they underpoll Republicans and they're doing it, when the Washington Post or ABC puts out a poll and it's 25% Republicans on my side of the fence, I'm like, oh well, every point the president's getting over 90% of the Republicans to vote for him, so every point you take us down, you're taking the president down a point. So it's we just deal with it. But these other polls that are there are some where they are doing more likely voter polls, and the battleground states absolutely matter more than the national polls. And but then you start going through it, and you're looking at it, you're like, how did they get, in a state where there might have been more Republicans, because all the battleground state polls are pretty close. And in terms of party affiliation, how did they get a poll with so many more Democrats than Republicans in that poll? So there's, and vice versa. There might be some every now and then that goes our way, but
Yeah.
I'm not in those groups to explain those polls.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to get to the swing states in just a minute, but Margie, I want to hear you too on this issue of, are a lot of these news polls particularly accurate? Are they in fact, as John's suggesting, underpolling Republicans and overpolling Democrats, in your judgment?
So, the only way to really know how a poll is conducted is to be the person there, overseeing the data collection and looking at the raw data file. I don't have the raw data file for the New York Times or Washington Post or CBS. So, I can't tell you what they're doing right or wrong, but I will tell you, just looking it up as we're talking, what Pew shows, and Pew's not limited by what's expensive or what's not expensive. They have $1 zillion. They invest in the industry of polling by using different methodologies and making sure that they reach people. They've done, I think, almost 100% cell phones in some ways, just because they feel landlines are now, less useful. So they have that kind of ability and that kind of budget. They have consistently showed since 1994 that Democrats tend to have the advantage over Republicans on party identification. Now that's not true in every single poll they've done, and they showed that what time was this poll done? This was from 2020, and so there was an uptick in, but this is what their words, Republican identification has ticked up since 2017. So they showed a little bit of an uptick, but still a Democratic advantage. So the reason that I suspect that a lot of polls seem to have more Democrats than Republicans is because there are more self-identified Democrats than Republicans. And we see this in a lot of the individual states where we'll look at registration and we'll compare it to identification, and there are more people who are registered as Republican but don't identify that way than the reverse, that registration on the Republican side can be a lagging indicator. So, I think there was a surge of Republican identification post-Trump, and obviously it depends on whether you're talking about how people who self-identify as independents, toward whom they lean, if you're talking about registration versus identification. There are all kinds of different ways of looking at this, but I think it's decades of tracking have shown that most years there are more Democrats than Republicans.
You would probably both agree turnout, though, is really going to affect this election in a large way, right?
Totally. And I agree. The midterms, 2018 midterms had record high turnout. So that's another sort of proof point of what's been happening. And I do agree that it is very tricky from a polling perspective to look at mail, absentee, in-person absentee, election day. Like that's, it takes a lot of questions to get to the bottom of that kind of answer.
Yeah. So let's peel the onion a little bit, though. I mean, do either of you feel that one of the parties has an advantage in turnout? I mean, obviously, when you're reelecting a president, it usually is a referendum on the president. And I don't know that my own personal view is I'm not sure this is that much different. Some might suggest that Democrats have perhaps an advantage in getting stirred up and out there to vote, and yet we certainly know that Trump supporters are really passionate about the president and will turn out. So, is there anything you're seeing in there that helps to give us a sense of what turnout is likely to be as you look at it both from the party standpoint and also demographically? Women, for example, now with Kamala Harris on the ticket. People of color, given everything that's going on right now. Are we seeing things? Are you seeing things in the polls that give you some hints as to where you're going to start to see elevated turnout? I mean, I'll give you an example. I remember the youth vote. we've talked about the youth vote for as long as I've been following politics. So our company helped MTV do Rock the Vote back in, God knows, I don't even know what year it was. I think it was Clinton. And every year, frankly, I get disappointed by the youth vote turnout, which doesn't really seem to be there, this huge increase. So what are you seeing that can give us some hints on turnout? Margie, we'll start with you and then John.
Yeah, well, you'll be pleased to know, Jack, that someone who ran Rock the Vote, I guess, a couple iterations ago, now is still working on mobilizing youth vote, and she just did a partnership with Snapchat, and they registered 600,000 people to vote. So that's which is pretty massive. Now, converting a brand new voter to a voter is harder, than getting a regular voter to vote again, of course. But it's the first step. And we just did a poll focused on young voters of color that we'll be releasing soon. And we found that, we should expect younger people to be a little bit less engaged in voting. I think that's not a surprise. They're moving around a little bit. They're less tied down to a specific place. They've had fewer interactions with sort of government and trappings of society and government. So they have just like fewer connections to, bill paying and healthcare and that sort of thing, schools and such. And at the same time, these voters are engaged. They're engaged. They feel that voting is important. It's how they make it, how they can make a difference about the issues that they care about. And we found that 25% of the young voters of color we spoke to have protested this year, and another quarter say that they think they might protest before the end of the year. So there is a lot of engagement. And I think this is, it is a year where, folks are going to be learning to vote. They're, getting used to all the new ways of voting, and they're going to be able to figure it out.
John, what are you seeing on turnout and among Trump voters?
By the way, it's painful. I used to be the token Republican at the choose or lose polling at MTV, but then I guess I aged out. So the thing,
you get that gray hair, John, and the hook comes out. Enough of you.
Well, my kids thought it was cool, but now they're old adults. So, but in the meantime, but Margie's obviously still young enough to do this, so that's good.
Yeah, exactly.
But the youth vote. The whole polls are not good predictors of turnout. I mean, there's other metrics for that in terms of what's going on. I mean, the difference, and right now you're seeing a big strategic difference in the way the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign are operating, where the Biden campaign is spending heavily on TV. They're leaving it to outside groups to drive the voter turnout, and a lot of those outside groups are doing very well with being well funded. And on the other hand, the Republicans, they're often talking about how their ground game is going, which is tough during a pandemic to be able to knock on doors and have voter contact. So there's a big difference there. And the president absolutely, he's also been hurt by it, because the rallies were a point of getting a lot of people excited. Now you got to do an airport hangar, and it's got to be outdoors, and you can't have as many people, et cetera, but it makes it harder. But those are all high-tech versions of trying to, like, we'll use the social media to be able to generate that extra turnout in those Trump. And there is a Trump voter who thinks the press is biased against the president, doesn't want to talk to a pollster, and you gotta figure out ways to get them to stay on the phone or answer your survey online and be there so you can capture their opinion. But the thing that Margie and I are both agreeing on is this turnout's going to be absolutely critical this year in terms of who does a better job of getting out their vote. And no, it's a real challenge for both of us right now, right? with the campaign.
Right. Margie, talk. You mentioned women of color, but talk more about the women's vote, because there's so much discussion about how particularly suburban and suburban white women are a key part of the swing vote in swing states. And I want to get to swing states in just a minute, but can you comment on what you're seeing in the research, particularly among suburban women?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on, where, and also suburban women are not monolithic, right? I think it's important when we're talking about suburban women as a swing group that means white women as a swing group, as opposed to, there are lots of non-white women who live in the suburbs. And also college educated women are less of a swing group now. Non-college women, those are the folks who are going to be more swing voters. College educated white women are very much in the Democratic camp, and were a key part of the successes of Democratic House candidates in 2018, and that doesn't seem to be changing in any real way. I know there are a lot of polls that show college educated white men now voting more Democratic too. I think the swing group is not college educated women, and I think but these voters are not monolithic either, and I think that folks of all stripes really want to make sure that they feel like they're getting good information, that they're being, spoken to and treated with care and compassion by candidates and people running for office, not just the top of the ticket, but everybody else. And also really understand, their lives and the challenges that they face, which are, a variety of, economic challenges, worrying about one's family, worrying about caregiving, whether it's, caring for children who are doing remote Zoom, or taking care of an elderly parent that you can't go visit. Those are the, things that people feel like are really acute right now. We did some polling recently about the issue of crime and which has obviously been the news and protests. And we found that, a couple things. One, that there was a sense that crime had increased nationally, but there was much less of a sense that people felt that in their own neighborhoods, that in their own community. So they had sort of heard the message that there was crime, did not necessarily experience that themselves. And that was true, really across the board, across a variety of different demographic groups. And that crime was a little bit lower on their list of priorities compared to other things like the economy and healthcare, and so on. And then we even found that, the trust between the two parties was basically even on things like crime and law and order. So I think, that there's this story out there that that women in particular are going to feel, physically threatened by crime in some way, and that will cause them to change their vote and vote more Republican. And I just haven't seen that in the data nationally, in a way that would, bear that out.
John, have you? Because certainly the president is, in this message, is talking a lot about law and order. So is that working?
And we had put out a national poll back in June. We do a monthly national poll for our company, for our subscribers, McLaughlinonline.com. And we found that over 6 out of 10 Americans were opposed to cashless bail, and 3/4 thought it would lead to an increase of crime. And they may not think it's in their community yet, because a lot of the suburbs are not defunding the police, but they're watching what's going on in the cities. And it's not just New York City and Chicago and LA, which is terrible, and the tragedies where you have, the attempted assassination of those deputies in Los Angeles, and you had policemen. There was a policeman killed in Western North Carolina the other day, and but you have crime going up and the shootings going up, and we are seeing, some movement of suburban voters, or particularly women, and not just white women. They're also, a lot of the suburban, in large cities, you'll find around the outskirts, there'll be first, second generation Hispanics or African Americans, who all of a sudden they're moving our way because they may not like the president's style, but they agree with them about supporting the police and not defunding the police, and they oppose cashless bail. They see cashless bail, which Joe Biden signed on to, and it's really causing a lot of problems around the country. So that's moving voters our way, and it's sad, because this is an issue that really, it's become partisan, but it shouldn't be partisan. We should support the police, and we should oppose these types of, and without equivocation, support the police, what they're doing, and trying to keep people safe. But it's definitely moving our way, because now it's a major national issue, and usually it's a state or local issue.
All right. Well, let's take that and move to the swing states, because I'd be interested in both of your points of view on a number of them, and there really aren't that many necessarily to talk about, although maybe you guys disagree. I mean, some, for example, John, you can answer this, and I think I might know your answer, but that, Michigan should get taken out of, is no longer in play. But you still got, they're both candidates are spending a lot of time in Wisconsin.
Yep.
They're spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
They're spending a lot of time in Florida, North Carolina. So talk to us about each of you about those swing states and what we're seeing there. Are they also individual that you really have to take them one by one, or are there trends that are working across those swing states? I grew up in the Midwest, so not to say they're all alike, but there are a lot of similarities in the Michigan and the Wisconsin and the Pennsylvania. But what are you seeing in the swing states? John, we'll start with you, and then Margie.
Well, President Trump tonight is going to Minnesota, and that tells you. I forget the polls for a second. If you want to know what the polls are saying, follow the candidates. The candidate, as you already alluded to, the candidate is the most valuable commodity in your campaign. The candidate's time, it's particularly when you're dealing with this pandemic. And if you want to know what's going on in the polls, the president went to Kenosha. The governor wrote, "The president don't come." The Democratic mayor wrote, "President don't come." He goes. 2 days later, Joe Biden follows him. And as you said, Joe Biden's already spending a lot of time in Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. The president was in Wisconsin last night. Joe Biden did go to Florida the other day to make 2 speeches, which is hard to do because you got to bring that teleprompter with you. And it's, and you had to do 2 teleprompter speeches. So watch where Joe Biden sends his teleprompter, because that tells you more than the polls. That's exactly where the fights are. And the fact that the president went over the weekend to Nevada and Arizona, that tells you a lot. Nevada was a close state last time. It's in play this time. Minnesota was close last time. It's in play this time. So if you forget the polls, disregard all the polls for a second, because there's polls out there that I'm like, it's much closer than that. And by the way, when you get a close poll, anything could shift it. With Obama was losing in 2012 to Mitt Romney until Hurricane Sandy hit. And then all of a sudden he goes and hugs Chris Christie, and on Monday, he goes ahead in the polls. So with an age of social media and instant communications, and you got candidates traveling like this, you watch where they're going in the battleground states, and that'll tell you where the priorities are, and that'll tell you what's going on in the polls.
Margie, what's your take on the?
So I would say a couple things. I think the basic battleground is most people would agree. It's not like somebody's got a whole completely different set of states. I mean, it's just a question of, how people rank them and prioritize them a little bit. I think we should add to this list, though, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina. Those are states that have high Latinx or African American populations that are going to, play a role. Texas and Florida obviously are expensive. They're expensive for everybody, and they're maybe that'll change a little bit in Florida. Texas is always sort of is a little big for anybody to really kind of wrap their arms around of. And I think John's right that we should look at where the candidates go. I think the other metric is where the candidates are spending money on air and television, and the Biden campaign is outspending the Trump campaign in a lot of battleground states, and that's a sign of a campaign that can expand the map and can play in a lot of places and has the resources to expand the map, both to gain traction there and also to have the other candidate then spread their resources across a variety of states.
So, John, since Margie just mentioned money, I mean, one of my questions I wrote down, it's just mind-boggling how much money now is getting raised in all campaigns, but certainly in presidential campaigns. And it was interesting to see a lot written about the fact that the Trump campaign appears to have gone dark last month in a number of key states, at least with respect to advertising, which I guess, Margie, is what you were referring to. Is there anything to make of that? Is that going to make any difference given the amounts of money that we're seeing being spent by both campaigns?
Trump
I
campaign.
mean, is there a point? Well, is there sort of a saturation point here where, frankly, it just doesn't make that much difference how much more you spend?
That's why it gets to be sometimes like you're bombing the rubble. But the interesting part is when you mentioned those points that were dark, we're actually moving up because the national stories were about. I thought Biden when he signed that socialist unity deal, that 110 pages with Sanders, all of a sudden we started getting a move where there's in the likely voter polls, and particularly in the battleground states, so start moving up. Kamala Harris, okay, San Francisco liberal moving up. He didn't get a bounce out of his convention. We might have gotten some bounces or some grind. It's more of a grind. Neither candidate bounces these days. We were grinding up, and it closed. And in a lot of states, and we were ahead in places that we think we're doing well in, but it's all close still. And so the Biden campaign is spending on TV because they're trying to get older voters that we have. We're spending money on social media because under 40 voters don't watch TV. They anywhere like the over 40 voters. And so we're spending on social media. We're doing a ground game because, it does become TV at some point becomes like bombing the rubble, and you need a mix. And I tell you, again, I'll go back to Obama's campaign in 2012. When he won that campaign at the end, he had 1 million people on Facebook open their contacts list to him. The average person on Facebook at the time was a 50-year-old woman with 300 friends. I mean, that is powerful when you do those kinds of things. In the Trump campaign, they underestimated us last time on social media, and worked out pretty well for the president. So
it did, but I haven't seen. Maybe you guys can enlighten me, but I haven't actually seen comparative numbers on the spend for both campaigns between TV and social media. But do either of you know? I mean, is John right that the Biden campaign is spending less in social media and emphasizing television more? I actually don't know. I mean, I've not seen anything really written. Margie, do you have a sense of where that is?
I mean, I'm just I don't have firsthand knowledge. I mean, I feel like I had heard, and so now I'm looking it up, that Biden has increased and has been able to outspend on social media. But I don't want to speak. I'm not speaking from inside knowledge.
Yeah.
I'm just doing the same Googling
Yeah.
anything else does. But
certainly the overall
it seems well funded. It seems well funded. They're having record fundraising numbers. They're able to increase and surge. I mean, the president clearly has like a thing on a relationship with Facebook, and which I think has been successful for him for sure. I don't think that means that social media is not available or that social media is preferable to television. I think that ultimately, all of it is important. Just like when we were doing telephone interviewing, we want to reach people on landlines and cells, and also through text. When you're reaching people, reaching voters, you want to reach them on cable and broadcast and mail and social media and anywhere, fields and any other way you can reach them.
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, from a marketing standpoint, take ourselves out of political campaigns for a second. In most of the recent presidential campaigns, something has popped that was used in that campaign that had real lessons for corporate marketers. I remember you go back to George W. Bush's campaign and what seems so quaint now, but the idea of demographics, so that if you owned a BMW, you'd be more likely to vote for a Republican, and if you owned a Ford or Chevy, you'd be more likely to vote for a Democrat. And then they mailed those people, and that was a huge insight. And the idea of demographics, or you were just talking, John, about Obama's campaign and a much more sophisticated use, certainly in his first campaign, of social media, which a lot of corporate marketers took note of. Is there something that's going to happen in this campaign that we're going to be talking about in corporate marketing circles afterwards, as saying, wow, that was a smart way of engaging people?
I think there is, but it's like I'm not giving away.
You're not going to tell us
state secrets right now, but they're clearly. I think they will. Well, whomever wins gets to brag about what they did that they thought was smart, and but both sides probably doing things right now that are new and unique, and also you do it because you have to be creative now, and you have to be smarter because it's such a challenge to be able to campaign. I mean, the things that worked for us pre-pandemic, we can't do right now.
Right.
And, like you said, you're from the Midwest. You can't, I'm not going to have a plane fly over a stadium with a banner right now with no fans in it at a Big Ten football game. There's old kind of things that don't work anymore. So you have to be creative, and you have to figure out how to get to people, how they've adjusted in their new lifestyles. So,
well, and that may be, and that may be, John, the finding, we're finding that in our own way we're working, that working virtually in many companies is, still pretty effective. And it may be that, all of the money and time that was spent on the huge rallies that, supposedly did generate a lot of excitement for a campaign. And then you end up with the turnout in a year when there were no rallies that far exceed years when you did have those exciting rallies. What does that tell you about the value of rallies? So I don't know. I ask you guys, the pandemic, of course, is driving this, but what kinds of changes is the pandemic bringing to voter behavior? I would guess one of them, Margie, you might comment on it, is because more Democrats than Republicans are seen to be doing it, but is mail-in voting. Is that a thing to stay, or is that just pandemic related?
I mean, I think it's such a good question, and it's one that I don't know what the answer is going to be to what did we learn about communications that we can apply to everything. I mean, I do think a couple things. I think, I was just talking about the importance of television, but broadly speaking, this entire cycle, the television ads have made less news than they have in previous election cycles over the primary and the general, with some exceptions. But there have been past years where the ad was a big story for a day or two. And I feel like that's happening a little bit less. And I don't know if that's a news change or if that's because we're communicating in all kinds of different ways. So I think that's one issue. I think another thing is, how do candidates communicate, period, not just the presidential campaigns, but anybody. So you have a lot of candidates trying to figure out how to reach people, making these kinds of decisions. Do I go to an event? Do I wear a mask at an event? Should I go to, what kind of event should I go to? Should I knock on people's doors? This kind of conversation, for folks who are concerned about the science is really, and spreading coronavirus is important. But people are adjusting, just like you saw, in Wisconsin, the state party of Wisconsin, Democratic Party of Wisconsin raised $4 million by having a table read of Princess Bride from the original cast. And that's a Zoom call, that raised $4 million. And, there have been candidates who have had big ticket, big heavy hitters do Zoom calls and raise money. Campaigns that were, already on people's radar have been successful. Campaigns that were struggling for some other reason when the pandemic hit have had a harder time adjusting.
Yeah. I'm multitasking here. We got 7 minutes left, and we do have some questions from those who are listening in. So I'll give you a couple of those. First one is has there been an uptake in poll participation this year since people may be working from home or have more time on their hands? Are you seeing people who are more willing to participate in 2020 than in previous years? That's a good question.
Yes. And the answer is yes, they have, for sure. And it happened right away, and maybe it kind of fell back a little bit, but it's still, I think, not harder to get people on the phones, for sure. And over time, since I've been doing this for, almost 25 years, it's a lot harder to get people on the phone than it used to be back in the days of 100% landline interviews, which I'm old enough to remember. But we've been able now to, get people on the phone. People do Zoom focus groups and, a telephone ID. I mean, we've found ways to adjust, and people have time and also, are interested in making their voice heard.
Yeah. John, same thing?
No, well, there were times where you could get people at home when there was a real shutdown, but it's still harder because of the amount of cell phones, particularly younger voters and more diverse voters. You have to, like Margie said, you got to use more cell phones, and it's harder to get somebody on a cell phone and especially if it's a longer questionnaire, to get them to answer it. So it's still difficult when you're trying to do a strategic poll to get it done. It's getting more complex. A lot of times a lot of times you're filling in with online polls. Online polls have become, and the interesting part is a lot of times online polls will have lower levels of undecided because people today might shy away from telling somebody in a live interview that they don't want to hurt their feelings or give them an opinion they don't like. So there's some socially accepted thing. So there'll be a higher undecided or don't know. When you do a poll online, people, it's like social media. They say and do things they might not ever say in public to your face, but they'll fill it out. So
yeah. All right, lightning round of questions because we've got 5 minutes left. We haven't hit. Somebody said a really good point. We haven't hit on the important Senate races because we've got, as most listeners will know, there are, the Democrats need a net of 4 Whitmore seats to control the Senate. If Vice President Biden wins, they'd need 3. I think I'm going to handicap it a little bit, but Alabama seems to be one that the Republicans can take back. But there are a lot of really tight races out there of Republican incumbents. Susan Collins in Maine, Cory Gardner in Colorado, Arizona. Talk to us, each of you, talk to us quickly about how you're handicapping the Senate races. John, why don't you start?
If President Trump wins, which we should, still a lot of time to go. If he wins, we can keep the Senate. He does not win, we're going to have a very hard time keeping the Senate. So,
Margie?
A way you can judge how the cycle is going is not, it's not just sort of what your assumptions going into the cycle, but also recruiting, fundraising. How are those things going? And by the recruiting and fundraising measures, it's a great cycle for Democrats in running for Senate. You've had top tier, whether it's Hickenlooper, you have two former governors, running in Hickenlooper in Colorado, Steve Bullock in Montana. You have battleground races in Kansas, North Carolina, Georgia, 2 races in Georgia. And then the ones that were always going to be battlegrounds of Maine, Iowa, and Colorado, North Carolina, those were always going to be, battlegrounds. And the Republicans, have not been able to expand the map. While South Carolina is now considered to be a battleground Senate race. So, you have the Democratic map expanding, just like we were talking about battleground states in the presidential race, and there isn't a similar expansion going on the Republican side.
My prediction of a surprise race will be Alaska.
Right.
I think he's a pretty strong, interesting candidate. Do you guys, each of you, do you have one surprise that you see among the Senate races? Or anyone you want to, guess nobody wants to predict anything?
I mean, it's hard to say that they're surprises now because you're talking about the same, Senate races all this time. I mean, yeah, I think for the ones that I see as the next sort of races, I guess the races to watch are Kansas, the two Georgia races, and South Carolina. That's in addition to the ones I think Colorado is moved to the left pretty considerably. Susan Collins has been pretty vulnerable now for a while, and so on.
Yeah. So last thing before we sign off, election night. Lots of concern about we actually at Weber Shandwick just did a poll, came out of the field last night. And surprised me, 45% of respondents said that they didn't think they thought the elections could be unfair and inaccurate. I mean, nearly half. We're going to there's talk of a red mirage, that on TV that night when most Americans are used to having the winner declared, we may very well not have the winner declared because of the time it will take to count absentee ballots and so forth. What are you both looking for on election night? Is there anything that concerns you about how this will all play out? Margie, we'll start with you.
I mean, I think the press now obviously there's this tension to kind of break the story and make an announcement, right? They're always tricking you on election night. We have an update, and it's the update they've given you for the last, 20 minutes. They're just sort of repackaging it. And so there's this, this pressure to kind of keep the ball moving. But I think everybody is now reluctant to jump the gun. And so I think even now, we found this in some polling that we've done that about half, and it's true across party lines, feel that we're not going to know the results on election day or election night. So I think people are managing their own expectations for this. And that's also been true in some of the primaries have taken a little while to calculate. So I think we feel like kind of nationally we're getting kind of braced for impact here. Now, so what I'm worried about is what happens if, not if there's no decision, but what if there's disagreement over what the results mean, right? If you have, one side thinks that they've won, the other side thinks they've won, then what happens? But I think, people are prepared for things to be delayed.
John, you think that's the case? People are getting prepared for an unusual election evening?
I think what you're seeing is a result of real cynicism towards the lack of media credibility. Because when you look at the last election, I was part of a campaign that was spied on, and they told us it was Russian collusion. There's no evidence of it. And now you go through, and by the way, on election day, when I talked about exit polls, on election day 2016, when I looked at the exit polls, when I got them at the end of the day, I got my leaks. I'm like, they're wrong. The demographics are off. You got to count the votes. And then on election night, we're trying to get them to make calls in states that we were clearly ahead, and the media wouldn't. So now what's going to happen? So the media has, going back to 2000 when they called it for Gore and it wasn't for Gore, and we had to, I was in a CBS studio waiting there all night. And 4 years ago, we were sitting there, and I'm telling my friends in the Trump campaign, we're going to move the president down to the ballroom because the media should be making the calls and not. You don't want to wait till 6 o'clock to talk to your supporters, 6 a.m. When they started moving them, all of a sudden they started making the calls. So the president, we're kind of used to being having biased media against us, and then the voters don't believe the media. So there's a real problem coming into the election because the reporting is creating their own problem, and if they've been more unbiased, I think people would have a better gauge to go by. But right now it's like but 4 years ago I was like, count the votes. That was I was telling people in the campaign. Let's count the votes and see where we end up. Here you're going to have you've got legal challenges right now before the election where there were court cases in Pennsylvania yesterday. There's governors using police powers to, okay, we're not going to vote in person, we're just going to vote in mail, and people want to vote in person. Most people would rather vote in person. So I think it's sad because you would like to have everybody have confidence in the electoral system that those results are the results. But right now, the track record and the history of the journalism on this has been, destroying their own credibility. And then you've got elected officials trying to change the rules from what people are, used to, that they themselves won't have confidence in it. So it's not good.
Well, we shall see, John. In fact, you'll be happy to know that one of the webinars we're going to have the media themselves on. So we'll talk about how they've been covering it. But that's actually all the time we'll have today. Thank you, Margie and John,
thank you so much
for joining us, especially in the heat of the campaign. Thanks to all of our viewers as well. We hope you enjoyed the first session of Election Matters 2020 and that you'll join us again. Our next webinar will be on Friday, October 2nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the topic of issues campaign in an era of disruption. I'll be joined by Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, and Mark Morial, the CEO of the National Urban League, to explore the dynamics at play as organizations like theirs communicate and engage and activate on obviously some of the most consequential issues facing American society amid both the pandemic and this election. So until next time, stay well, everybody.